Hello. I'm not. This isn't N+1 because this is talking about future stuff. But I just wanted to introduce the ideas that are coming along at the moment inside Tibet binding. And Tibet binding is not a replacement for Swiss, so we're not throwing everything away. It is an extension of Swiss binding. So all of your existing binding should work within Tibet binding, but we're adding a few new features. So the things we're looking at doing at the moment are particularly about multi-binding and about improving the syntax of value converters and about being able to enable more kind of advanced multi-binding scenarios. So let's take a look at, so all I've done is set up a basic first stage project with Droid, Store and Touch, and it builds. So all I've done is exactly what I do in all the N+1 demos. But in here we've got a first view model, and what I'd like to do is, okay, so we've got an hello in there. Let's also add a number in there. Oops. And that's going to be an int underscore counter. And then let's also in this same project add a value converter. So I'm going to add my normal value converter, which is a length value converter. And I'll inherit from, oops, not from app start, but from value converter. Value converter, and I'll use the generic form, which allows me to say that this is always going from a string on the view model to an int in the view. And for this, we're only going to convert one way, so what I'll do is I'll override convert, and this is going to return if value equals null, return 0, otherwise return value.length. So that's a very simple value converter. We could also return another one if we wanted to. Let's add a Boolean converter, so let's do a public class salutation value converter, and this is going to do MVX value converter, and this is going to go from a int to a string, and what we're going to do is we're going to override convert again, and let's say int is age, and so what we're going to do is if value is less than 21 we're going to return higher. Otherwise we'll return something like welcome. So it's just, you know, a little bit of friendliness that we'll put in there for salutation. So that should build, we hope, if we build it. And then what we'd like to try and do is use that within our Droid app. So let's go to our Droid app, check that this is building. And obviously, to start with, this is just going to have the default layout. So let's take a look at that layout in first view. And so you can see it's just got text hello and an edit text. So let's change this so we've got, let's also use a bit smaller font so that it fits in. So we'll use size 20, which is a lot smaller. So we've got hello, and then the other one was counter. And what I'd quite like to do is I would just quite like to start with, let's just put hello plus counter into the text view. So that's all we do. So this should change whenever hello changes or whenever counter changes. And in fact, let me just put this at the top so that the keyboard will never obscure it. Yeah, and again, I'll change it down font size. So this text view, which is a text block, which is a UI label, if you like, is always going to contain hello plus counter, and that's what it should show. So let's take a look at that running. Let's check it's working to start with. Debug start new. And that should come up in this emulator when it's packaged. And you can see there, hopefully, the syntax for the hello and plus counter is just saying, I want to bind to two things. And whenever any one of these changes, so let's change this one to 55, then it changes at the top. And whenever this one at the bottom changes, then it also changes. So you can see how these things are bound. A multi-binding is really simply done. So that's stage one. We'd also quite like to, so you know, there's actually a few stages. There's multi-binding in there, and there's this plus operator. That was a bit ugly. So actually what we really want to do is we want to do counter, and we'd kind of like to have that salutation on there. So normally what you'd expect to do to get the salutation is you'd expect to do converter, you know, this is Swiss binding, equals salutation, and that will just pick it up using the conventions. So if we just run that, you know, using the conventional approach, then that should go across to the emulator and we should see at least this change. Let's just check that. So by default it starts at 0, and anything up to 21 will give us that, but let's go to 23 and then you see it changes to welcome. If you go back down to 20 again, it changes. So there's the welcome. Yeah. However, that's, you know, that syntax is fine, but really what we'd like to do is we'd like to make it a bit shorter. So we've added as part of this Tibet effort this syntax where you're just using, like, making it look like a function. So now you're applying salutation to counter, and that's applying the value converter. And that will work two-way as well if you have a simple two-way in there, but let's just see. So that's going to deploy and we should see exactly the same effect. So again, we'll go up to, oops, I don't need text in there, sorry about that. If we go up to 34, you can see it changes, back down to 4, and so forth. So that's still working as you expect. And then you can combine these things together. So you can then have, you know, also perhaps you want to put a space in there, in which case you could put a space, and then you put hello in there. And so that syntax says apply the salutation to counter, and then please put a space in and please bind to hello. So let's do that. Hopefully that'll come up. So here at the top here, hopefully you can see it says hiya, hello MvvmCross. So let's just pretend this is my name instead, and let's put, okay, we'll just put MvvmCross in there. And then you can see that if I then change my name to be 23, and let's just remove the space at the start so you can see the space has been added. Yeah, so that's the sort of thing you can do, and obviously you might do that with salutation, first name and last name, and you might bind in as well, you know, a PhD or something at the end, and that can all just work. So that's the Tibet binding working there. You can also, if you wanted, for example, have an offset in here. So, you know, you could add, well, actually, I'm going to offset this by 10 for whatever reason, or you could subtract in here as well. There isn't a huge syntax available at the moment, but you can, you know, if you want to do all sorts of complicated things, and you can nest as well, or at least I think you can. So if I was to do length of hello in here, then we would see some very weird effects in here. Because what we would do then is we would take counter, which would be a number, length of hello would be a number, they should get added together, and then the salutation will depend on it. So let's just try that. I've not tried this yet, the new syntax. We're using quite a test-driven approach to get this syntax working, so I believe it will work. And I believe it will carry on working, but it's an interesting experiment to do this particular bit live. So let's see, we start it up, and you can see there, so we've got higher. But in theory, if I keep typing here, then at some point it hits welcome because it's hit the 23 characters. So there you can see, you know, that is a very complicated thing. But also we could then, for example, do a minus here. A minus, oops, does it let me? Maybe it's not letting me do the binding to the minus, unfortunately. Let's see if I can. So if I apply minus there, you can see that, you know, it's quite happily changing. And as I get a smaller number, so -2 perhaps, no, I might be right on the cusp. Let's add in a few more characters there, so that's a welcome. And then if I increase this to a -5, say, then that'll change to a higher. So you can see the kind of math that's being done here, and you can see how you can have, so this text is being bound to both counter, and it's being bound to hello twice, and it's then being bound to the salutation. So this might not be the most efficient code in the world. There might be problems with this. It's probably updating twice, for example, when you change hello, but that doesn't matter too much. If it does ever get to a problem with maintainability and performance, then obviously you can pull it back out and put it into the view model instead. But as a quick way of prototyping, that's quite nice. So that's a quick introduction to it in Droid. Let me just show the same code running in iOS. So let's go to iOS, and what we're going to do is we will use the same type of approach. So I'll have a label at the top and a text field underneath it and another text field. Obviously, you know, normally you'd probably do this using a better approach, using a zib or something to lay this code out, maybe something like zib free to also do it. So these two text fields, the first one we're binding to hello and the second one we're binding to counter. And then what we need to do is we want to change this first label so that it displays a similar type of thing. And we haven't got a fluent syntax for this at the moment because this is early days. But what you can do instead is just use the string. So let's take that string that we had in Droid, which was this guy, and let's put it in there like that. And then I believe, although I haven't tested this, so it's an interesting experiment, that if we change this to iPhone Simulator, and if we set this as the startup project, and then hopefully we can, oh, it's thinking about it anyway, hopefully we can then run, and I'll need to bring up my remote desktop. I'll need to spell tightly NC correctly. Oops, it doesn't look okay, so it doesn't look particularly happy, but hopefully it'll go across. And then I need to type in password, and I need to select the right combo box. Sorry, it's thinking about it. So let me do that. Simulator and debug start new. That's another password entered. Then hopefully when I get over here it's thinking about this Tibet binding. Let's see what happens. And so it's starting it up, and if this doesn't work I'll just go on to the next. So I haven't actually updated this yet, so there you go, that was a brand new project. Let me copy the app delegate information across from the generated code and try again. Debug start new. And then what we should see when we kick into this, hopefully it's going to start up, is we should see the same binding are working. If it doesn't, then as I say, I'll move on and I'll come back and debug it, but hopefully this will just work. It's saying unexpected character at. Okay, so what I can't do at this moment is I can't debug this, so let me just see. What's its problem? Let me do this not using this syntax, so that, as I say, this is not quite working, this syntax at the moment. So instead of that, what we'll do is we will do this dot add bindings, and this is going to be a binding, so this is a new dictionary object string. This is the old way of doing it, and so this is going to be for the label. We're going to bind to, and I think the syntax was text this. So yeah, and that needs to be in curly braces. So yeah, you can't use this old syntax, sorry about that, for this at the moment, but what you can do is this setup, and then let's try it. And so, you know, it's just a different way of adding the bindings. It's the way we used to do it before we had the fluent syntax. So that will go off and start, and hopefully this time won't crash. Let's see. Right, so you can see here we've got our two fields. We've got hello MvvmCross, and we've got that. So if we remove this and bring it down to George, then you can see we've got that binding in there. And if we put this up, so George has 6 letters. So in theory, if we get to about 25 or something, I'm just going to need to change the zoom so I can actually see the keyboard. Scale, oops. So if we change to numbers, sorry about this being a bit small, then you can see that the binding is working fine in there, and it's no longer happening at 26. I guess it's happening about 15 somewhere, and so 14 won't change it. Yeah, but if I add another letter, then it'll change to welcome. So that's that very complicated binding working, and that's working in Touch and in Droid. So now we get to Windows, and Windows is always going to be a bit different because Windows has oops, let's wait for this to disconnect. I'll also disconnect my remote viewer. And within Windows, what we have is we've obviously got, so I've only got the store project, but it's the same for Windows Phone as well. I haven't written .pf yet, but I think that should be relatively straightforward to do. And in Windows, what we have is we have this app setup with just a text block and a text box. And obviously what we can't do here, because we're in this curly brace land, is we can't start chucking all sorts of plus whatever in here, because it's going to start moaning at us. So what we've actually had to do is we've had to replace Windows binding. And so to do that, what we do is we have to add a new NuGet package. And again, I'm just doing this locally. These aren't available online at the moment because they're a bit too alpha. So I'm going to add this, and it's called the binding extensions for Windows only. Sorry, there is a version of these available online, but it's not the version that's got this multi-Tibet binding in it. And then what you can do for this text block is, instead of having this binding, which I'm going to remove, you can instead have a bind, and the IntelliSense then within Visual Studio and ReSharp will help us. And for this bind, we should be able to just chuck across the same syntax from here. And even though we haven't imported those value converters, it should just work, because the value converters will get picked up on their own by the store. The only by the conventions. The only things we do have to do is initialize the binding. And to do that at the moment, you have to override the the initialize last chance. Somewhere down here, initialize first, last chance. And in there, we'll do the base call, and then what we'll do is we'll do a builder equals new MVX Windows binding, binding builder. And that takes as its parameters a binding type. You can either use Windows binding, which obviously won't work for us, or you can use MvvmCross binding. And then you pass in the list of where the value converters are going to be, and in this case the assembly where they all are is in the core, so we'll do core.app, and that's .assembler.get. It's a get type info, because it's in WinRT and they don't have get type quite the same anymore, and that's going to be assembly. So all we're doing there is telling it where to look for value converters, and you could have a list as long as you wanted of value converter assemblies. And then once we've done that, we just call builder.doRegistration, and that will set up the binding for us. So with that done, in theory, we should be able to do debug start new. And in theory, it should go off and build and deploy. And in theory, we should have, okay, and it's really hard to see, so I'm just going to go back and change the font. So that's an earlier n+1. Oh no, it's just not showing in the debugger. I don't know why. So what I'll do is I'll just change the font. So this is going to be a font size equals 45, say, and I'll do the same for this one. And then we also obviously didn't have a counter on there, so let's add a counter. And you'll notice that I'm mixing and matching the binding styles here. So you don't have to use the new MVX binding style, you can use the old one if you prefer to. But let's just see what happens when we do this. So debug start new. It's not running in the debugger, probably because I've got it set up as iPhone simulator, but that's okay. And then what we do see here is, if we change this number to the 24 and tab away, then that binding is updated. And also if we change this guy and tab away, then again it's updated, and we've got this strange thing where if we get to 2 then it's higher or whatever. So hello's got 5 letters, we need to get to 21 to get the welcome. So if we add 16 then we get welcome, but if we add 14 then we get higher. So I appreciate what I've just shown you isn't, the most obvious business sense in terms of the binding. This hello text salutation counter plus length hello plus hello isn't, a genuine use at all. But I just wanted to show you that's how you can apply these value converters, and how they can be bound together, and how you can also get this multi-binding working. So I'm going to leave it there. That is the food for thought, as it were, about whether or not these things are there. Other things you might want to use it for are, for example, you could use this. Okay, I said I was going to leave it there, but I'm not. You could, for example, add an image, and the height and width of this image I will set to counter. So so actually I can do this straightforwardly. I will do this as a so the source for this we want to bind, and the image we want to bind as well. So let's do this. So what we're going to do is we are going to apply the same binding. So MVX:bi bi.nd equals, and we're going to bind the source for the image to what we'd like to bind it to is http://placekitten.com/ and then obviously what we need here is a plus counter And again, then we need a slash plus counter. And again, this wouldn't be the most optimal because this is probably going to update twice every time I call counter. But I believe that should actually work for us. And what I'll do is I will fix the height and width of this to be 300. Because what you'll see is obviously that the image will then scale within that 300. And I guess I could put a stretch mode on there. Stretch equals. So what I'll do is I'll uniform fill whatever the image is. And let me also just change the view model so that counter is now going to start with a value of 200. So if I then run up this store, let me build core to make sure it's rebuilt. And then let me run up store. Oh, something's happening. I don't want to debug unit tests on that at the moment. Debug, start new instance. Then let's just see whether or not that works or whether I've fooled myself. So has the image come up? Doesn't look like that image has actually come through, which is a shame. Debug. Set this as the default. See what debug information I get, whether I've just messed up. Invalid cast exception. So okay, so it's not working quite as I'd hoped, but if only, huh? But that's the type of thing that I think you should be able to do with this. You should be able to get that together. I can't quite see what I've done wrong. Image, is it source? Have I got that right? Let me just check what that would have been. With text block, and I'll just do text equals. So I believe I should have been able to set that. Obviously I've done something wrong and we will have to work out what that is. But for now, you know, let's just show you what it would possibly have been here. And yeah, so it would have been that, but clearly I got something wrong in my binding, so cool. So that's the sort of thing that I think we should be able to do. And you know, there are possibilities there. So I just wanted to share those. I hope you've seen, you know, that's the syntax that we're going to have in Windows. And if you needed to bind multiple things, you could. So you could also have, you know, a color here or something, or a height or a width or whatever you want. So you could just say here, I'm going to bind the height. I think you could even bind the font size here to counter, for example. That might be an interesting example. Let's see that. See if I can come back from the brink of that disaster for the place kit. So now if I bind this, then you can see that's there, and if I change the font size down to 2, then hopefully you can see it's just about there, but bring it up to 20 and you can see it's a bit clearer, bring it up to 50 and you can see it's back in. So that's the way that you'd get these things to pull together. Could be done using multi-binding, again, not too much of a worry. Yeah, so that's the sort of thing that I think we can do quite straightforwardly. And I'm really producing this just to ask what people think, whether that sort of syntax is what they want or if they've got better ideas. Whether they like this value converter type syntax with this simple expressions for plus, or whether people have other ideas. I will leave it there, and that was a very quick sample of Tibet binding. Let me know what you think.